The book of Ecclesiastes, the book that is seemingly built around the question, and the seemingly rhetorical question of what's the point? This is a book that traditionally has elicited groans when suggested as a Bible study topic. I mean, you read through chapter 1, and the preacher, as the main character in the book, picks out a quality of life that almost everyone admires and aspires to, and then kind of crushes everybody's hopes and dreams and says, nope, it's just vanity, just a chasing after the wind. Then we read chapter 2, and he picks out a few more qualities of life that are rightfully admired and decides they're vanity too. And you get to chapter 5, where he picks out another quality. Well, you kind of get the picture. It kind of rinse and repeat a lot in this book. And the idea is, well, everything is pointless. Everything is what's usually translated as vanity, and which I believe the Hebrew word, if you go back to it, is just a vapor, a smoke, something that's extremely temporary and just not substantial. But like I said, I don't think it has to be that. Allow me to demonstrate. About 20 years ago, I saw a movie called The Village. It was about a small community set somewhere deep in the woods, and judging from the clothes the villagers wore and the technology they used, probably sometime 19th century, I guess. And throughout the movie, the elders of this village kept warning the younger ones of the danger of the towns and the ferocious and grotesque wolves that roamed the woods in between there and the towns, outside the confines of this village. Well, of course, most of the way through the movie, an emergency develops in the village, makes it necessary for one of the young ones to venture into towns. And along the way, she starts to unravel the truth about her parents, about her village, about her whole young life. She finally gets to the towns to get the needed medicine for her community, and something happens that finally explains every single weird and unexplainable thing that happened throughout the whole rest of the movie. Now, this movie was written by a man named M. Night Shyamalan. That was kind of his trademark at the time. He made several other movies that revolved around a small cast of characters facing some kind of vague but sinister threat, and placed in a setting that just somehow wasn't quite right, but you couldn't quite put your finger on. And then toward the end of the film, something would happen that would blow your mind and make everything else in the movie finally make sense. Now, I've said all that to say this. Like these movies, the 11 chapters of Ecclesiastes that we spend recoiling and saying, what's Solomon thinking, make that last minute reveal that much more impactful, much more powerful to the point of the book. So now that we can rest assured that there will be an answer to this question that's addressed by this book, I want to go back and look at some of the lessons that we can learn from this really beautiful composition about the true meaning of life. So if you haven't already, you want to go ahead and make your way over to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. And I'll have the scriptures that we use up here on the screen as well. But we'll read here in a moment. But Ecclesiastes, as we mentioned, is commonly attributed to Solomon. Now, there's some language in the book that makes many scholars question whether it was written by Solomon or whether it's presented by another ancient writer as a way to learn from the story of Solomon. But there's clues within the text that point to, at the very least, this being written about the story of Solomon. And, everything fits the person that's describing here would have the resources that Solomon had. So you're going to hear his name a lot throughout this lesson. Solomon was king of the United Kingdom of Israel. But he was not only that, but he was the son of David. David is, of course, the person that's used by the rest of the Old Testament as the official measure of a good king. when a king was pretty good, they'd say, well, he did almost everything right in the sight of the Lord, but he wasn't as good as David. It's a slight paraphrase, but that was kind of the language that would be used. And not a small thing, Solomon was granted by God to be the wisest man on earth. He had used his wisdom and power to build the temple of God, to greatly enrich the kingdom of Israel, and to enrich himself. And it seems from the context here that he had been on a quest for true fulfillment, and that he had used all the vast resources that he had on hand to do that. And what follows Ecclesiastes acts as sort of an official findings report of his quest. So we'll begin, as I said, in chapter 1. And we're after identifying himself. He gives what appears to be an overview of the results of the research that was conducted. He says in verse 2, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil in which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and round goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All the streams run into the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. Man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were in Jerusalem before me. And I'm going too far. We'll leave that up there for the next one. But right off the bat here, we realize that the success of his quest not looking like such a good prospect. It's difficult to read this bit of poetry without maybe a little bit of a whining pout. When I see this, I think the sun rises, the sun goes down, the wind blows to the south, goes around to the north, everything's full of weariness, all vanity. Talk about your first world problems. This guy had everything. He was still not satisfied. And I think he was legitimately not satisfied, even given all these things. So let's take a look further to see why. After giving this overview, Solomon goes on to break down this research into sections. And he goes on to talk about this thing is wisdom, something he would know a little bit about. He was, after all, endowed by God to be the wisest man on earth. And it was something that he wrote beautifully about, not only in the Proverbs, but it's in this book. And yet here in chapter 1, and there in verse 16 through 18, as we have up on the screen, he says, I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were in Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this is also a striving after the wind. For in wisdom there is vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. And so we start to see a theme in the book regarding the resources of the preacher. He had a lot of them. In verse 16, we read the great wisdom surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before. Well, Solomon most certainly would have been this descriptor. And when it comes to somebody with a lot of wisdom and knowledge, we're not just talking about a guy who yearns for knowledge and has almost unlimited resources, and he's amassed this library of the world's greatest works of literature. Oh no. Those guys existed, but those guys would have had a Solomon section in their library. This was by, again, wisest man in the world. He not only all the knowledge the world could hold, he had the wisdom to be able to use it. Well, he had the wisdom to make it all make sense. The satisfaction still eluded him. You ever anybody like that? You ever been anybody like that? That someone who just seemed to have all the answers, somebody who could seemingly solve everybody's problems but their own? Solomon certainly fits that description. And the preacher was, as is called in this book, is most assuredly someone like that. Indeed, knowledge is our goal, and being the smartest guy in the room, and that is the motivation. Then we'll never get to the place where we feel we've reached it all. Because as you've probably experienced, the more you know in life, the more questions that appear. And after a while, it may look an awful lot like striving after the wind, chasing something that'll never be caught. So, unsatisfied with storing up wisdom, the preacher moves on in his quest for fulfillment. How about pleasures? Well, if wisdom brings only vexation, as Solomon said, or as the text says here, then surely the answer is simply to enjoy the time we have here. And Solomon, one who would have been, who that had been given, and as we'll see, had in some ways earned, because he'd done a lot of work, a great deal of resources. He was king of a great empire. He commanded a navy to bring in food and drink and building supplies and anything else he could want. Why not use it? So we continue reading in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, and in verse 1, he did just that. He said, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure, enjoy yourself. But behold, this was also vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched my heart to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay on folly, till I might see what is good for the children of man to do under the heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted them with all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest growing trees. I brought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than anyone who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil. And this was the reward for all my toil, that I considered that all my hands had done, and the toil that I had expended doing it. And behold, all was vanity, and a striving after the wind. And there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Now, the preacher here is, if you look at these 11 verses, he's not necessarily speaking of the toil of getting wealth. Everything that this is wrapped around is the toil of using it, of using great wealth, the work involved in enjoying yourself with the unlimited resources that he had. So, well, tell me you've never dreamed of, right? The wealth without the toil of getting wealth, be it the lottery or just the conversations you might have when the big number comes up and everybody's talking about it on the news and stuff, or an inheritance from a rich uncle, striking oil in the backyard like Janet, or anything like that. Whatever it is, there's not many of us who haven't thought, if that was me, I'd fill in the blank with whatever thing that I would buy or whatever thing that I would do. I had a conversation with a coworker the other day, and we were talking about land and houses and what kind of things we like. And he's, I don't think I'd want a lot of land. The only way that I buy a lot of land is if I won the proverbial lottery, and I could get our crew to take care of it because I just don't like yard work. And I said, well, I disagree. I get all the land that I can, and doesn't have to be manicured. I just want to know that it's there and that it's mine, right? They could grow up in woods and fields and everything else. Might not go out and enjoy it, but I knew that I could if I would. And the conversation went on. And it sounds silly, but it is. what would you do? Would you travel to cover yourself with fine clothes? Maybe buy a sports team, watch your club win the Super Bowl or the World Series from your own private box, or forget sports, maybe a warehouse full of Mustangs or Camaros or Roadrunners, or maybe even a Ferrari or a Rolls if you're feeling fancy that day. Personally, I thought an island would be cool. Well, now we're getting a bit far afield, but that's kind of the point. It's enjoyable to sit back and think about sometimes. What if? Then, of course, the writer here breaks from our pleasant dream and says, nope, been there, done that, not even worth the effort. Why? Why would that be? And well, we'll read on. We skip over to chapter 3. He says there, I said in my heart with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them, that they may not see themselves, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what is to the children of man, and what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts. For all is vanity. All go to one place, all are risen from dust, and to dust return. All go to the grave. That is, in other words, just like the words on a t-shirt you used to see sometimes in high school. He who dies with the most toys dies. Is basically what the preacher is saying here. And it's true. All that enjoyment, that fun in the sun is going to come to an end. And as he was enjoying this, you could tell this thought was there. Hard to enjoy this when I know that, well, one, it's going to come to an end. We find out elsewhere in the book, he talks about that somebody else, somebody who probably doesn't deserve it, is get all of this stuff to enjoy for themselves, and I'm going to be gone. And he said, no fulfillment in that. Well, all right. So all of this over the top lavishness is vanity. I can buy that. How about some moderation? Just living sensibly and wisely. Well, believe it or not, Solomon tried this. In Ecclesiastes, we'll go back a bit, chapter 2. Tried this. Was he successful? Well, kind of. He was able to do that. And in chapter 2 and verse 13 rather, then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than folly, as there is more gain in light than darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head. Weird phrase, has his eyes in his head. You first read that and go, well, of course he does. But it makes sense if we try to think of it in our modern tongue, right? That guy really has his head on straight. He doesn't have their heads on straight, but you know what he's talking about. Somebody that has their wits about them, that is keen to their senses, knows what's going on. And the fool walks in darkness. Yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. Then in my heart, what happens to the fool will also happen to me. Why then have I been so very wise? I said in my heart, that this is also vanity. Yeah, he was able to pull off this idea of living wise, of doing the right things for success, not running off into foolishness and excess, not making his resources and his gifts and his blessings be his worst enemy, as happens with a lot of those lottery winners you think of. But he still concludes that it's all vanity and it's all striving after the wind. And so it goes, chapter after chapter, bemoaning the fact that no matter what we do, no matter how we live, no matter how we're known in this life, it's all going to end someday, years from now, and nobody's ever going to exist. So what's the point of even trying? Uplifting, isn't it? So I'll find my place eventually. And this is the point. This is the point where you kind of look at this book and realize why someone might groan and considering this a topic for a Bible study, a protracted study. You know, I've had this suggested before, but I've never been a part of a class that just took this apart week by week and after a week and studied each one by one without gathering the whole book as a whole. But I think if you do that within a month, you probably need counsel. But not to fear, because long about chapter 5, we start to get some glimpses into what might be the solution to all of this. Throughout the first half of the chapter, the preacher talks about making a vow to God and to always be sure to fulfill it. It says in verse 7 that it is imperative to do so, because he says, for dreams increase and words grow many. Oh boy, try this again. When dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity. But God is the one you must fear. Did you notice something there? And I know we haven't read all the way through this book word for word, but this is one of the first times in the book that there is hinted at something outside of our normal everyday existence. If we flip forward to chapter 8, we'll see another glimpse of something more. And after in this chapter, seemingly lamenting the fact that sinners can prosper and sometimes the good people don't prosper, he says in verse 12, though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, says, yeah, that is true sometimes, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God. The preacher acknowledges here that doing good may not be rewarded right now, it may not be rewarded in this life, but it will still be rewarded. And it's about this time that, at least for me, for you, it may have come much earlier, but it takes me longer sometimes. But a light comes on, and I start to think, okay, it's easy to read through the first 98% of the book and think, well, everything is pointless, so why even try? That's kind of what it's saying, right? And then what we can do is lump every good thing that we can think of into that everything. And be it helping others or following God's word or being involved in the church and the work that goes on. But the message so far in the book has been much, much more qualified and filtered down. What we've been told in this book so far is that everything that this world has to offer is pointless and a vapor and ends in death, so why even try? Everything that this world has to offer is what Solomon has chased after at this point. And it's true. Everything else that we read in the Bible agrees with this 100%. If we go all the way forward to the New Testament, John, in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 18, says in 3 verses, says basically the theme of Ecclesiastes in 3 verses, what we've got 12 chapters for, but that's all right. It says in verse 15, do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in it. For all in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. Because just as John ends in this 3-verse passage with a but, Ecclesiastes is going to end with that same but. Because as Ecclesiastes ends, there in chapter 12, we see that the narrator kind of takes over, and we stop hearing from the preacher so much as about the preaching. And the writer goes on for a few verses, and finally, in the very last 2 verses of the entire work, He says the end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Ecclesiastes, in all of its gloom and doom and talk of unfairness and vanity and striving after the wind, a perfectly depressing picture of what it's like to try and win at worldliness. To try and make everything make sense and be fulfilled without God. It always is failure. You want fulfillment. You want life to fulfill what should be its true purpose. Fear God and keep his commandments. As our Savior exhorted, store for yourselves treasures in heaven. This is what matters. Because as John said, this world is passing away. Anything that we might have in a goal in our lives, in the way that the preacher talked about in Ecclesiastes, whether it be family goals or career or investments or political or whatever they are, I might have a 40-year plan. And I might start out as a township trustee. And I got steps. And I got it all planned out. I'm going to get with this guy, and then maybe I'll run for county commissioner. And after a few years of that, I'll get out of that. Maybe, I'll get into this, and all the way up 40 years from now, I'm going to be president of the United States. You know what I got? I got a short-term plan. That's a short-term plan. When we look at our lives and the entire length of them being eternity, it's a short-term plan. So what Ecclesiastes shows us is that if we're going to be fulfilled, if we're going to find satisfaction in this life, we'll have to be thinking about the next. We're going to have long-term plans and be working toward them. Well, if you are lacking in any way when it comes to what really matters, whether it's that you sit there and you think, okay, I need to follow him better, or you need to come back to him, you need to come to him at a time this morning. We want to help. If you need that help in any way, please don't. Please stand.